The Battle of Saratoga was the pivotal turning point in the American Revolution, forever altering the course of modern history. This decisive victory marked a crucial shift in the global balance of power, as the newly formed United States began to forge its own destiny. The fate of empires hung in the balance, and the world would never be the same again. In the autumn of 1777, the landscape of upstate New York was ablaze with color, as if the very trees themselves were set aflame by the fervor of revolution. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the whispers of a continent in turmoil. It was amidst this backdrop that the fate of empires would be decided as the Continental Army, led by General Horatio Gates, prepared to face off against the British forces under the command of General John Burgoyne. The British strategy, devised by Burgoyne and his subordinate, General William Phillips, was to split the colonies by marching south from Canada and meeting up with a secondary force under General Henry Clinton, who would be pushing north from New York City. This pincer movement, they hoped, would isolate New England from the rest of the colonies and deal a crushing blow to the rebellion. As the British Army marched south, they encountered numerous challenges, including treacherous terrain and a lack of supplies. The dense forests and winding roads of upstate New York proved to be a formidable obstacle, slowing their progress and testing the mettle of Burgoyne's troops. Despite these difficulties, the British remained confident in their superior training and numbers, believing that they would ultimately prevail against the ragtag Continental Army. Meanwhile, General Gates was busily preparing the defenses at Saratoga, a small village nestled in the heart of the Hudson River Valley. The Americans had chosen this location carefully, recognizing its strategic importance as a gateway to the colonies. Gates's forces were bolstered by the arrival of General Benedict Arnold, who had played a crucial role in the earlier Battle of Lake Champlain and was now eager to prove himself once again. As the two armies drew closer, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Skirmishes broke out between American scouts and British patrols, each side probing the other's defenses and searching for weaknesses to exploit. The Continental Army, though outnumbered, had the advantage of familiarity with the terrain and a deep understanding of the land they were fighting to defend. In the days leading up to the battle, General Gates and his staff worked tirelessly to prepare their troops for the impending fight. They constructed earthworks and fortifications, utilizing the natural contours of the landscape to create a formidable defensive position. The Americans were well aware that they could not match the British in a straight-up fight, so they would need to rely on cunning and strategy to outmaneuver their foes. As the days passed, the Continental Army's defenses at Saratoga continued to take shape, with General Gates overseeing the construction of a complex series of earthworks and fortifications. The Americans had chosen a strategic location, nestled in the hills and valleys surrounding the village of Saratoga, which would allow them to funnel the British Army into killing zones and exploit the terrain to their advantage. General Arnold, meanwhile, was tasked with scouting out the British Army's movements, using his knowledge of the local terrain to identify potential weaknesses in the enemy's lines. On September 19, 1777, the British Army, led by General Burgoyne, emerged from the forest and began to deploy on the plains surrounding Saratoga. The Americans, arrayed behind their earthworks, watched with bated breath as the British formed up into lines of battle. The air was electric with tension, as the two armies faced off against each other in a contest that would decide the fate of the American Revolution. General Gates, observing the British deployment from his command post, noted that Burgoyne's army was divided into three main columns, with the left wing under the command of General William Phillips, the center under Burgoyne himself, and the right wing under the command of General Friedrich Adolf Riedesel. As the British began to advance, the Americans held their fire, waiting for the enemy to close to within range of their cannon. The sound of drums and fifes filled the air as the British Army marched steadily forward, its ranks dressed and disciplined. But despite their imposing appearance, the British were about to encounter a formidable obstacle: the American defenses at Saratoga. General Arnold, riding along the American lines, urged his troops to hold their fire until the British were within range, warning them that the enemy would try to break through their defenses with a series of frontal assaults. The 1st British column, led by General Phillips, advanced on the American left flank, where it was met with a withering blast of cannon fire from the American artillery. The British troops, attempting to storm the American earthworks, were cut down in droves, their bodies piling up in front of the American lines. Meanwhile, General Herodotus' column, advancing on the American right flank, encountered similar resistance as the Americans poured volley after volley into the German troops. The sound of musketry and cannon fire filled the air as the two armies clashed in a frenzy of blood and steel. As the British columns continued to advance, they were met with a maelstrom of artillery fire from the American positions. The earthworks, carefully constructed by General Gates and his men, proved to be a formidable barrier against which the British charges were repeatedly broken. The sound of cannonballs whizzing through the air, crashing into the British ranks, and sending splintered wood and shattered bodies flying in all directions, was deafening. General Philip's column, which had been advancing on the American left flank, stumbled backward under the withering fire, its troops seeking cover behind a screen of trees. Meanwhile, General Herodotus' column, which had been attacking the American right flank, began to falter as well. The German troops, weighed down by their heavy packs and cumbersome equipment, struggled to maintain their formation in the face of the intense American artillery fire. As they wavered, General Arnold saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow. He ordered his men to launch a counterattack against the German troops, hoping to catch them off balance and drive them back in disarray. The American troops, buoyed by their success in repelling the British charges, surged forward with renewed confidence and enthusiasm. They poured down the slopes of the hills, their muskets at the ready, and crashed into the German lines with a fierce battle cry. The Germans, already reeling from the effects of the artillery fire, were quickly overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught. They stumbled backward, abandoning their positions and leaving behind their wounded and dead. As the German troops retreated in disorder, General Herodotus attempted to rally them, riding forward on his horse and shouting orders above the din of battle. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The American counterattack had broken the German lines, and the British Army's right flank was now exposed and vulnerable to further attack. General Burgoyne, observing the chaos unfolding on his right flank, realized that he needed to act quickly to restore order and stabilize his lines. He ordered General Phillips to shift his column to the right in an attempt to plug the gap created by the German retreat. But as the British troops began to move, they were slowed down by the difficult terrain and the intense American artillery fire, which continued to rain down on them from all sides. As General Phillips' column struggled to reposition itself on the British right flank, the American artillery continued to wreak havoc on the British lines. The guns, cleverly sighted by General Gates's artillery commander, General Henry Knox, poured a withering fire into the British ranks, causing widespread destruction and chaos. The British troops, attempting to shift their position, were forced to navigate a maze of muddy roads, dense woods, and steep hills, all while under intense American fire. Meanwhile, General Herodotus' German troops, who had been driven back by the American counterattack, were attempting to regroup and reorganize behind a screen of trees. However, their efforts were hindered by the continued American artillery fire, which threatened to cut them off from the rest of the British Army. As the Germans struggled to maintain their cohesion, General Herodotus himself became increasingly concerned about the vulnerability of his troops to further American attacks. General Burgoyne, aware of the precarious situation on his right flank, began to shift his reserve troops, including the iconic Grenadier Battalion, to support the beleaguered German forces. However, this move was slow to develop, as the British commander had to navigate the complex web of muddy roads and dense woods that crisscrossed the battlefield. As the British reserves began to move, they were forced to contend with the same difficult terrain and intense American artillery fire that had already broken the German lines. The American forces, sensing the weakness in the British position, continued to press their advantage. General Arnold, who had led the initial counterattack against the German troops, now urged his men to push forward and exploit the gap in the British lines. The American troops, fueled by their earlier success, surged forward with renewed confidence and enthusiasm, pouring down the slopes of the hills and crashing into the British reserves. As the American forces advanced, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance from the British Grenadiers, who were determined to hold their ground against the onrushing American tide. The Grenadiers, renowned for their discipline and fighting prowess, formed a dense, impenetrable line, bristling with bayonets and muskets. The Americans, undaunted by the formidable British formation, launched a series of fierce assaults against the Grenadier line, hoping to break through and shatter the British army once and for all. The ensuing battle was intense and chaotic, with both sides trading volleys of musket fire and artillery blasts. The American forces, driven forward by their momentum and determination, slowly began to gain ground against the British Grenadiers. However, the British troops, fighting with desperate courage, refused to yield, and the battle hung in the balance, as the two armies clashed in a frenzy of blood and steel. As the fight raged on, General Burgoyne became increasingly concerned about the stability of his left flank, where General Philip's column was still struggling to reposition itself. The British commander knew that if the Americans were able to break through on his left, they would be able to outflank his entire army and cut off his line of retreat. With this in mind, Burgoyne began to shift troops from his center to support his beleaguered left flank, hoping to prevent a catastrophic collapse of his army. As General Burgoyne shifted troops from his center to support his beleaguered left flank, he ordered General William Phillips to hasten the repositioning of his column, which was still struggling to navigate the muddy roads and dense woods that crisscrossed the battlefield. Meanwhile, General Henry Knox, the American artillery commander, continued to pour a withering fire into the British ranks, causing widespread destruction and chaos. The British troops, attempting to shift their position, were forced to contend with the intense American artillery fire, which threatened to cut them off from the rest of the army. As the fight raged on, General Burgoyne became increasingly concerned about the stability of his center, where the American forces were beginning to gain ground. He ordered General Simon Fraser, who commanded the British 24th Regiment, to lead a counterattack against the Americans and restore the balance of the battle. General Fraser, a seasoned veteran of the British Army, formed his troops into a tight column and led them forward, determined to drive back the American forces and secure the British position. The British counterattack was fierce and well coordinated, with the 24th Regiment advancing in perfect order and delivering a series of devastating volleys against the American lines. General Arnold, who had been leading the American forces, was wounded in the leg during the fighting, but he continued to urge his men forward, determined to secure victory for the Continental Army. As the British counterattack gained momentum, General Gates, the American commander, became increasingly concerned about the stability of his right flank, where the British were beginning to gain ground. He ordered General Enoch Poor, who commanded the New Hampshire militia, to lead a counterattack against the British and restore the balance of the battle. As the fight raged on, General Burgoyne became increasingly concerned about the stability of his army, which was beginning to show signs of weakness and disorder. The British troops, who had been fighting for hours, were exhausted and demoralized, and their lines were beginning to waver. General Burgoyne knew that if he could not restore order and discipline to his army, he risked being defeated and forced to surrender. With this in mind, he ordered General Fraser to lead a final counterattack against the Americans, hoping to drive them back and secure victory for the British Army. As General Fraser led the final British counterattack, his troops advanced with determination, but they were met with fierce resistance from the American forces. The Continental Army, bolstered by the arrival of reinforcements from General Gates's command, held their ground and delivered a series of devastating volleys against the British lines. Despite being outnumbered, the British fought valiantly, but they were ultimately unable to break through the American defenses. Meanwhile, General Burgoyne's situation was becoming increasingly dire. His army was exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, and he knew that he could not hold out for much longer. He had hoped to receive reinforcements from General William Howe, who was supposed to be marching north from New York City, but there was no sign of him. Burgoyne's only option was to try and break through the American lines and make a dash for Fort Ticonderoga, where he could regroup and reassess his situation. As the British counterattack faltered, General Fraser was mortally wounded in the fighting. He was shot in the abdomen and fell from his horse, and despite the best efforts of his surgeons, he died a short time later. The loss of General Fraser was a significant blow to the British Army, as he was one of their most experienced and respected commanders. As the day drew to a close, the British Army retreated back to their defensive positions, exhausted and demoralized. They had suffered heavy casualties, and their morale was at an all-time low. General Burgoyne knew that he could not hold out for much longer, and he began to consider the possibility of surrender. He called a council of war with his senior officers, where they discussed their options and debated what course of action to take. The American forces, on the other hand, were jubilant. They had repelled the British counterattack and were now in a strong position to dictate the terms of the battle. General Gates was hailed as a hero, and his troops were praised for their bravery and determination. The Americans knew that they had won a significant victory, but they also knew that the war was far from over. They would have to continue to fight hard to secure their independence, and they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. As the night fell on October 7, 1777, the British Army settled in for a long and uncertain night. They knew that they would have to face the American forces again in the morning, and they steeled themselves for what was to come. The Americans, meanwhile, were busy tending to their wounded and preparing for the next phase of the battle. They knew that they had the upper hand, but they also knew that the British were far from defeated. The Battle of Saratoga was far from over, and the outcome was still very much in doubt. The night was cold and dark, with a thick fog rolling in off the Hudson River. The British Army huddled together for warmth, trying to get some rest before the fighting resumed in the morning. General Burgoyne walked among his troops, trying to boost their morale and reassure them that they would emerge victorious in the end. But despite his brave words, he knew that the situation was desperate. He had to find a way to break through the American lines and escape, or risk being trapped and forced to surrender. As the night wore on, the Americans began to make their preparations for the next day's fighting. They moved troops into position, brought up artillery, and made ready to launch a final assault on the British defenses. General Gates was confident that he could break through the British lines and secure a decisive victory, but he also knew that it would not be easy. The British were tough and determined fighters, and they would not give up without a struggle. As the night wore on, General Gates's troops continued to prepare for the final assault on the British defenses. At dawn on October 8, 1777, the American artillery opened fire on the British lines, pounding their positions with a relentless barrage of cannonballs and shells. The British returned fire, but their guns were outnumbered and outgunned by the Americans. General Burgoyne, realizing that his position was becoming increasingly untenable, ordered his troops to fall back to a new defensive line, hoping to buy time and regroup. However, the American forces were too strong, and they quickly pushed forward, taking advantage of the British retreat. The Continental Army's General Enoch Poor led a brigade of New Hampshire troops in a bold assault on the British right flank, while General Daniel Morgan's riflemen attacked the British left. The British lines began to waver, and soon their entire position was in danger of collapse. As the American forces closed in, General Burgoyne realized that his situation was hopeless. He had lost many of his best officers, including General Fraser, and his troops were exhausted and demoralized. With no hope of reinforcement from General Howe, Burgoyne knew that he had to surrender to avoid a massacre. On October 8, 1777, he sent a messenger to General Gates requesting a ceasefire and asking for terms. General Gates, eager to bring an end to the bloodshed, agreed to meet with General Burgoyne to discuss the terms of surrender. The two generals met at the nearby home of Colonel John Hardin, where they negotiated the terms of the British capitulation. After several hours of talks, they reached an agreement, which became known as the Convention of Saratoga. Under its terms, the British Army would surrender their arms and equipment, and in return, they would be granted safe passage to Boston, where they would be shipped back to England. On October 17, 1777, the British Army marched out of their camp and formally surrendered to the American forces. It was a solemn and dignified ceremony, with both sides showing respect for each other's bravery and sacrifice. General Burgoyne, accompanied by his officers, approached General Gates and handed over his sword, symbolizing the surrender of his army. The consequences of the Battle of Saratoga were far-reaching and profound. The American victory convinced France to ally itself with the Americans, providing significant financial and military support that would help turn the tide of the war. The British government, shocked by the defeat, began to question its strategy and ultimately decided to shift its focus from the northern colonies to the southern ones. In the aftermath of the battle, General Gates was hailed as a hero, and his reputation as a skilled commander was cemented. However, he would soon face criticism for his handling of the Convention of Saratoga, which some argued was too lenient on the British. General Burgoyne, on the other hand, was widely criticized in Britain for his role in the defeat, and he would eventually face a court-martial to answer charges of incompetence. The Battle of Saratoga marked a significant turning point in the American Revolutionary War, as it thwarted the British strategy of dividing the colonies and convinced France to enter the war on the side of the Americans. The battle also showcased the bravery and determination of the Continental Army, which had proven itself capable of defeating a major British force in a pitched battle. The Battle of Saratoga stands as a pivotal moment in American and world history, a testament to the power of determination and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The Battle of Saratoga will forever be etched in our collective memory as a shining example of the human spirit's capacity to shape the course of history. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.